Hello everyone and welcome to another making up video. Today I'll be showing you how I made this simple summer dress. This dress is shaped with darts and it ties in the back to define the waist. It's made from a soft jersey and incredibly comfortable and easy to wear. And it's also pretty easy to make. I had mine finished in just a few hours. The fabric I used for this dress is a printed jersey from the children's apparel section of Joann's. I nicknamed this the Doodle dress, since that's the name of this fabric collection. This particular print is covered in woodland animals, along with flowers, mushrooms, and other cute things. It's not the type of fabric I would usually buy, but I couldn't resist it. And I'm using 2¼ yards of it for this dress, in case you were wondering. I started by pinning my circle skirt pattern to the folded edge of the fabric, and when doing this I made sure the print was going horizontally so the animals won't be on a weird angle at the front of the skirt. Then I cut the skirt out. I left a 1/2 inch of fabric on one side for seam allowances since I forgot to add that to my pattern. And in case it wasn't obvious, the pattern I'm using is only 1/4 of a circle skirt, but when it's cut out on the fabric's folded edge, it creates a half circle. If you want more information on how to draft and sew a circle skirt, I have a detailed tutorial on the process that will be linked down below. Then I repeated the whole process once again. This way I'll have 2 half circles which can be sewn together to form a full circle skirt. Now I'm pinning the bodice pattern in place with the center front lined up on the fabric's fold. The pattern I'm using was self-drafted, but it's a fairly basic 2-piece bodice pattern with darts at the front. If you can find a bodice pattern with a similar dart placement, you can use that as a base. Just cut down the neckline so it resembles the one that I'm using. I'm also pinning the pattern for the back of the bodice onto the fabric. As you can see, this pattern slopes out at the center back, which makes the waist several inches larger. This is intentional. The additional room means I can get the dress on and off without having to add a zipper. But I will be adding a waist tie to cinch it in, so the dress should still be pretty flattering in spite of this. Then I went ahead and cut the pattern out, and this is the worst part of making this dress because you feel like you're cutting through all these woodland animals and it's horrible. Once that was done, I marked 2-inch wide strips on the fabric's bias. These will be used to create bias binding for the bodice. And if you're wondering why I'm cutting these strips out on the fabric's bias, it's because fabric has more natural stretch when it's cut diagonally, which means it forms around curves far more smoothly than a horizontally cut strip, and it's also less prone to fraying. And lastly, I'm marking a 3½ inch wide strip onto the fabric, which will be used for the waist ties. Then all of these get cut out. Try and ignore the screams of the fabric animals whilst you're doing this. And before doing any sewing, I used a pencil to transfer the dart pattern onto the back side of the fabric. Then to prep for sewing, I pinned the back panels together with the wrong sides facing each other. This is done because this seam will be a French seam. Then I sewed together the back panels. After doing this, I trimmed the edge down and sewed the seam once again, this time with the right sides facing each other to create a French seam. After that, I pinned together the darts. When doing this, you want to match up the pencil lines and make sure each pin goes through both pencil lines. And the darts are sewn in place. After that, I pinned the waist ties into tubes with the right sides facing each other. And I sewed the ties into tubes with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then I used a safety pin to turn them the right way out. This is done by pinning the safety pin to one end, then feeding it through the tube until you reach the other. The waist ties were ironed, then I pinned them into the side seams of the back panels, 3/4 inch away from the bottom edge. Then I pinned the front panels to the back panel with the wrong sides facing each other. The side seams are sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then the seam allowance is trimmed and sewn once again, this time with the right sides of the fabric facing each other. This creates a French seam. Now it's time to bind the edges of the bodice, but before doing that, I had to make the bias binding. I already cut out all the strips of fabric for this, so all I had to do was iron the raw edges inward towards the center of the strip. Then the right side of the bias tape is pinned onto the wrong side of the arm openings. This is sewn on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then the folded edge of the binding is pinned to the right side of the fabric. You can usually use the stitches used to secure the other side of the binding as a guide for getting this even. Then top stitch the binding down as close to the folded edge as you can. This process is repeated on the neckline of the bodice, except instead of the binding ending where the neckline ends, it will keep on going and create straps for the bodice. The straps are 4 inches long. I marked this onto the bias tape, then started pinning the binding to the back of the bodice at this point. Once again, I'm sewing the binding on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then folding the bias binding over the raw edge and pinning it to the right side of the fabric. When it comes to the straps, I just folded the bias tape in half so the two folded edges were touching, then I pinned it in place. The binding is sewn on as close to the edge as I could get it, and this is continued even when sewing the straps. Now I'm getting back to work on the skirt. I let it hang overnight so it could warp, which is something circle skirts do since they are cut on the fabric's bias. Then I used my paper pattern as a guide so I could trim the hemline to be even once again. Then I sewed the skirt panels together with French seams. I ended up diving right into the hemming process. As you can see, I'm turning the bottom edge inward by approximately a 1/2 inch and stitching it in place. I would not suggest doing this since the hems of circle skirts can be challenging to do since they are curved. I was feeling confident enough to do this by eye and without pins, but I would highly recommend you take your time to turn the edge inward and pin it in place before sewing. For the next step, I did use pins. Here I'm turning the hemline inward by another 1/2 inch and pinning it in place. Now I'm sewing as close to the edge of the material turned inward as I can, trying to make the stitching an even 1/2 inch away from the hemline. And I'm working slower than usual to make sure the jersey doesn't stretch as I sew, since that would cause the hem to pucker. With the skirt finished, I went ahead and pinned it to the bodice. I pinned them together at the side seams first, then moved outward from the center front. This seam was sewn with a 1/2 inch allowance, and that's it! Usually I would bind this edge, but that can prevent the fabric from stretching, and I wanted some ease in this seam, so I left the edges raw. There are a few things I would do differently if I made this dress again, but I'm pretty happy with the end result. I think it's a really cute style and the print is adorable. And perhaps my favorite thing is that this dress is my ideal length, unlike a lot of summer dresses which aren't made for my height and end up being too short. I think that, in addition to the cute print, will motivate me to wear it a lot more often than some of the other summery dresses that I own. I really hope you enjoyed seeing how I created it and that you'll stick around since I will have another video up next week. For more information on this project, check out the description box, and I think that covers everything. Thank you again for watching, and I shall talk to you all very soon.